The letter arrived on a Wednesday morning, not a phone call. That detail matters, because I remember standing at my mailbox in the November cold, still wearing my reading glasses from breakfast, watching my breath cloud in the air while I sorted through the usual nothing utility bills, grocery circulars, a catalog for tools I'd never buy. Then, at the bottom of the stack, a cream-colored envelope with a return address I didn't recognize. Hargrove and Blythe, attorneys at law, Nashville, Tennessee. I stood there on the sidewalk for a long moment, just holding it. Eleanor lived in Nashville now. Had for the past 11 years. I went inside, set the envelope on my kitchen table, and finished my coffee before I opened it. At 62, I'd learned that bad news doesn't get any worse for waiting. The table wobbled slightly when I set my mug down, one leg shorter than the others. I'd been meaning to fix it for 3 years. I never did. The letter was brief, professionally worded. My name was Victor Callahan. I was being contacted by the law offices of Hargrove and Blythe regarding the estate of Eleanor Hartley Callahan, who had passed away on October 29th, following a brief illness. I was named in her will. My presence was requested at the reading, scheduled for the following Friday, November 14th, in Nashville. It was not optional. The nature of the bequest required my attendance in person. I read it twice, then set it down. Eleanor was dead. My ex-wife, the woman I had once believed was the other half of everything I was, the woman my son hadn't spoken to me about in 12 years without contempt in his voice, the woman who had built a real estate and hospitality empire worth, according to the last Forbes profile I'd read, somewhere north of $250 million, Eleanor was dead. I sat in that kitchen for a long time. The November light moved across the linoleum in slow degrees. I thought about calling my son, Andrew, but I already knew how that conversation would go. Brief, polite in the way that's worse than cold. He'd ask if I needed anything. I'd say no, and we'd hang up after 4 minutes. We'd been having some version of that conversation for 12 years. I thought about Eleanor instead, about who she'd been before everything. We'd met at Georgia Tech. I was finishing a graduate degree in civil engineering. She was an undergrad studying business administration, working 20 hours a week at a hotel front desk to cover her books. She had this quality I noticed immediately, a stillness in difficult moments, a steadiness that looked effortless, but wasn't. I found out later she'd grown up poor, the eldest of 4 kids, and had trained herself not to panic, because someone always had to be the one who didn't panic. We got married when I was 28. She was 26. We had almost nothing, and were genuinely happy about it. Andrew was born 3 years later. I was the one who handled the early years diaper changes, pediatrician appointments, school pickups, because my job as an engineer with the city gave me more flexibility than Eleanor's did. She was building something by then. A small property management company she'd started with $15,000 and a used laptop. I believed in her completely. I never doubted for a single day that she would build something real. She did. By the time Andrew was 12, Hartley Group was managing commercial properties all across the Southeast. By the time he was 16, she was developing them. The money came fast once it started. We moved from our ranch house in Decatur to a newer home in Buckhead. Andrew went to a good private school. I made senior engineer at my firm. Everything was working, until it wasn't. I've gone over the sequence of events in my mind so many times that the details have worn smooth, like stones in a river. I could recite them in my sleep, but reciting them doesn't make them feel any more real. Eleanor's company, by the time Andrew was 17, had grown into a partnership with a man named James Whitfield. James had brought in outside investors, and together they'd leveraged heavily into a development deal in Chattanooga, a mixed-use project that was supposed to anchor a revitalized riverfront district. It was ambitious. It was also over-leveraged, and when the anchor retail tenant pulled out 9 months before opening, the whole structure started to collapse. Eleanor had been moving money. I knew she'd been under pressure. I hadn't known the full extent of what she'd done, shifting investor funds between accounts, borrowing against assets she didn't fully control, papering over gaps in the books to keep the project alive long enough to find a solution. She'd told herself it was temporary. She always intended to put it back. Then the SEC opened an inquiry. I remember the night she told me. We sat at our kitchen table, a real table then, expensive, solid oak, and she laid it out in that steady voice of hers. What she'd done. What it would mean if investigators looked at the books. It wasn't just her company on the line. It was her investors. It was James Whitfield, who had trusted her with his reputation. It was Andrew's college fund. It was everything. My name was on several of the business accounts. As her husband, as the co-signer on certain asset documents, I had legitimate access. That access could look, to an investigator, like participation. She didn't ask me to do what I did next. I want to be clear about that. She laid out the situation. She cried. I sat there, and I thought about Andrew, 17 years old, getting ready to apply to colleges. So proud of his mother. So certain that our family was built on something solid. I thought about what a federal fraud conviction would do to Eleanor, to everything she'd worked for since she was a 20-year-old girl working a hotel front desk to buy her textbooks. I told her I would handle it. I went to the investigators and told them I had been managing the accounts independently, that the discrepancies were mine, that Eleanor had trusted me and I had misused that trust. My lawyers worked to shape the narrative. I had a clean record. I was cooperative. I had access to the accounts and, on paper, the ability to make the transactions she had made. There were questions. There are always questions. But I answered them steadily, and I didn't waver. I lost my engineering license. I was convicted of securities fraud. I served 26 months in a federal correctional facility in Macon, Georgia. When I got out, I was 53 years old, and the world had rearranged itself around the hole where my life used to be. Eleanor had filed for divorce 14 months into my sentence. She visited me twice during those 26 months. The second time, she sat across from me in the visitation room, with her hands folded on the table, and said she was sorry. She said she was going to take care of Andrew. She said she'd make sure I was all right when I got out. I told her to focus on our son. I told her to build something good with the second chance I'd given her. I never said it like that as a gift, as something owed. I didn't feel that way then. I just wanted her to be okay. I just wanted Andrew to grow up with something intact. Andrew was 19 when I went in. By the time I got out, he was 22 and had already decided who I was. His mother had been careful. She never said anything directly against me. As far as I knew, she didn't need to. The facts, as my son understood them, were clear enough. His father had secretly betrayed his mother's trust, committed financial crimes, gone to prison, and broken up their family. Andrew had filled in the rest himself. I tried, for years after my release, to reach him. Not to tell him the truth. I'd made a decision about that, and I held to it, just to be his father in whatever small way he'd allow. I went to his law school graduation and sat in the back of the auditorium and left before the ceremony ended. I sent cards. I called on birthdays. He always picked up, always spoke to me for exactly as long as courtesy required. And then he was gone again. I rebuilt what I could, found consulting work, behind-the-scenes engineering analysis that didn't require a license. It paid enough for my apartment in Charlotte, a 2-bedroom that I kept spare and clean, a habit from Macon that never left me. I had a drafting table in the spare room where I worked on projects no one would ever build, bridges, community centers, schools in neighborhoods that needed them. I drew because I had to do something with my hands, and because the buildings in my head were still good even if nobody would ever let me put them in the world. That was my life when the letter from Hargrove and Blythe arrived. I drove to Nashville on Thursday evening, got a room at a mid-range hotel off the interstate, and lay awake most of the night staring at the ceiling. I had no idea what Eleanor had left me. I couldn't imagine what there was to say after 12 years of nothing. I thought, distantly, that it was probably a token enough to signal that she remembered, not enough to mean anything. A gesture. I was almost relieved by that thought. Gestures I could handle. The offices of Hargrove and Blythe were on the 21st floor of a glass building downtown. I took the elevator up and watched the city spread out below as I rose and tried to feel something about being back here in Eleanor's city, the city where she'd become the person she always planned to be. The conference room was large, with tall windows and leather chairs around a long table. Several people I didn't recognize were already seated business types. Eleanor's people, I assumed. Partners, advisors, and at the far end of the table, just setting down his phone, was my son. Andrew looked up when I walked in. He was 40 years old and wore it well, handsome in the angular way his mother had been, with her same quality of stillness, the same sense that he was the most composed person in whatever room he occupied. He wore a dark suit and a watch that caught the light. His face, when he saw me, went carefully neutral. "Dad," he said. Not warm, not cold, just acknowledging the fact of me. "Andrew," I said, and took a seat near the other end of the table. We didn't speak again before the attorney entered. Her name was Rebecca Torres, mid-40s, precise, carrying a document folder and a separate sealed case that she set at the head of the table with particular care. She thanked everyone for coming. She explained that Eleanor had left specific instructions about the order of the reading. She asked that everyone hold questions until the end. Andrew leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms loosely. He looked like a man waiting for something he'd already calculated. Rebecca began with the standard language, charitable bequests, gifts to longtime employees, a scholarship endowment at the university Eleanor had attended at night while working her way up. Andrew nodded occasionally, his expression patient. Then Rebecca said, "To my son, Andrew Hartley Callahan, I leave the sum of $500. The room went very still. Andrew uncrossed his arms. Something moved across his face that I couldn't read. "Excuse me," he said quietly. "There's more," Rebecca said. "Your mother left a letter. She specified that it be read aloud to all parties present." She reached into the sealed case and withdrew several handwritten pages, protected in clear sleeves. She laid them on the table in front of her and smoothed the first page with her palm. I watched Andrew watch her do this. I watched his jaw set. Rebecca began to read. Eleanor's voice came through in the words, that measured cadence I still recognized from 20 years of marriage. "To those present today, I have spent 12 years building something I was proud of, and I am not able to leave this world without acknowledging what it was built on. Not just my own effort and my own vision, those things are real, and I claim them, but also something I should have claimed long ago, and didn't. A debt. On the night of March 8th, 2008, I made a series of financial decisions that constituted fraud. I moved investor funds between accounts without authorization. I falsified records. I told myself it was temporary. It was not temporary. It was a crime. And when investigators began to look, I was terrified. My husband, Victor Callahan, took the blame for what I did. He was not the one who moved the money. He was not the one who falsified the records. He had access to those accounts because I had given it to him, because I trusted him, and he used that access to construct a story that protected me. He went to federal prison for 26 months for a crime I committed. He lost his engineering license, a career he had spent 30 years building. He lost his marriage, his daily relationship with his son, and what should have been the best years of his professional life. I let him do it. I told myself I would find a way to repay him. I told myself that by building the company, by ensuring Andrew had every opportunity, by making the settlements with the investors whole and then some, I was making it right. I was not making it right. I was making myself feel better about something I did not have the courage to face. "Andrew, your father is not the man I allowed you to believe he was. Everything you decided about him, his weakness, his selfishness, his failure was decided on the basis of a lie I permitted to stand. Your father is the most decent person I have ever known. He sacrificed everything he had without being asked. And he never told you, because he thought protecting the image of your mother was more important than his own reputation. He was wrong to make that choice, and I was wrong to let him. This is the only honest thing I have left to give you. The truth. It is late. It is insufficient. I am sorry." Rebecca set down the final page. The room was so quiet I could hear the ventilation system in the ceiling. Andrew was staring at the table in front of him. The stillness he always carried had changed quality. It was the stillness of someone holding something very carefully because they were afraid of what would happen if they let go. That's not possible, he said. His voice was flat. She was not. This doesn't make sense. There's more, Rebecca said. She reached back into the case and produced a sealed envelope and a small hard drive. Your mother prepared a sworn video statement 4 months before her death, witnessed by 2 attorneys and a notary. She also commissioned an independent forensic accounting review of the 2008 transactions, which confirms the pattern of activity originated from her terminals on dates when your father was documented to be elsewhere. She set the hard drive and a tablet on the table. The video began without ceremony. Eleanor appeared on the screen. She was seated at a desk. I didn't recognize her home office in Nashville, I guessed, from the light. She had aged in the years since I'd last seen her face in any detail. The illness had taken something, but her eyes were clear, and her voice, when she spoke, was steady. Andrew, she said, you're going to want to believe this isn't real. You've organized your whole life around a version of events that made sense, and I'm asking you to tear that down, and I know how much that costs. I'm asking anyway. Your father went to prison because he loved us. He came home and rebuilt his life from nothing, and never once told anyone what he'd done, because he'd decided your opinion of me mattered more than your opinion of him. That was his choice. It was a better choice than anything I made during that entire period of my life. I'm telling you the truth now, because I don't want you to spend the rest of your life treating a good man like a stranger. The video ended. Andrew pushed back from the table. For a moment I thought he was going to walk out, the way a man does when the room has become too small for what he's feeling. But he didn't. He stood there with his hands on the back of his chair, looking at the table, breathing. She's been gone 3 weeks, he said, and she's sitting here telling me. He stopped. Rebecca spoke quietly. Your mother's remaining estate, after the specified bequests and charitable gifts, is approximately $240 million in assets, holdings, and investment accounts. She has left the entirety of it to your father, with one condition. She turned to me then, and for the first time in the whole proceeding, I felt the room tilt slightly. To Victor Callahan, Rebecca read, I leave everything I have built, with the understanding that it should be used to do some good in the world. You were always better at that than I was. You knew what buildings were for. I just knew what they were worth. The one condition of this bequest is this. Find James Whitfield, and make sure he knows I'm sorry. Make sure his family is taken care of. Beyond that, the rest is yours. Do something real with it. You always knew how. I couldn't speak. I sat there with $240 million being handed to me by a woman who had been dead for 3 weeks, and I couldn't make a single coherent word happen. Andrew's voice broke the silence. It was quiet now. The anger drained out of it. How long have you known? He asked me. I found out when you did, I said. I didn't know any of this was coming. He looked at me then, really looked at me for the first time in years. I saw him working through something behind his eyes. That same methodical quality his mother had, the one that had always made him a good lawyer. Why didn't you ever tell me? He asked. All those years, all those phone calls, you could have told me. Because she was your mother, I said. Because you needed her to be someone you could be proud of. You were building your life. I wasn't going to take that from you. He sat back down slowly. He put his hands flat on the table and stared at them. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet. I told people my father was a criminal, he said. I told clients. When the subject came up, I told my friends. I told the woman I was dating last year that I had a complicated relationship with my father because he'd made terrible choices. You didn't know. I should have asked more questions. You were 19, and then you were 22, and you had a story that made sense. People don't go looking for reasons to tear down the stories that make sense. He pressed his fingers briefly over his eyes. When he dropped his hands, he looked like someone who had just put down something very heavy. Rebecca excused herself, and the other people in the room found reasons to leave quickly and quietly, the way people do when they recognize they're standing in the middle of something private. Within a few minutes, it was just Andrew and me, and the December light falling through the conference room windows. We sat there for a long time without speaking. I don't know how to do this, Andrew said finally. I don't know how to be angry at her when she's gone. I don't know how to apologize to you for 12 years when I don't even know where to start. I don't know who I've been working so hard to become. If the thing I was working against wasn't even real. You became a good lawyer, I said. That's real. Whatever you built it. That doesn't go away. I built it trying to be nothing like you. He said it without cruelty. Just fact. Disciplined. Controlled. No mistakes. No weakness. Every decision by the book. He paused. Turns out I was trying not to be someone who never existed. I reached across the table and put my hand over his briefly. He didn't pull away. You're here now, I said. He nodded. He didn't say anything else for a while. We got dinner that night at a place a few blocks from the hotel. Sat across from each other in a booth and talked more in 3 hours than we had in the previous decade. About his work, his cases, the apartment he'd been living in alone in Chicago for the past 4 years. About the woman he'd broken up with because he'd told her he was too guarded to be good at it. About the things he remembered from when he was small, coming to my office on weekends when Eleanor had meetings, sitting at the corner of my drafting table and drawing his own versions of buildings on copy paper. He remembered that. I hadn't known he'd held on to that. I drove home to Charlotte the next morning. The following 3 months were unlike anything I'd experienced. Lawyers and financial advisors and accountants filled my calendar. The estate was complex properties across Tennessee, Georgia, North Carolina, investment portfolios, business interests. The numbers felt fictional. I kept waking up at 4 a.m., certain there had been a mistake. The first thing I did, before any of it was finalized, was find James Whitfield. He was living in Savannah, retired, 63 years old. He'd rebuilt his career after the Chattanooga collapse, rebuilt his reputation slowly, the way you do when you've had to start over. It took a few weeks to track him down through mutual contacts from the old industry days. He picked up on the second ring. I told him who I was. There was a silence. I always thought something was off about what happened, he said carefully. I told him the truth, all of it. What Eleanor had done, what I had done, what Eleanor had admitted before she died. He listened without interrupting, which told me something about the kind of man he was. When I finished, he was quiet for a while. She always felt wrong to me, those last months of the project, he said. Something behind her eyes when we talked about the books. I figured it was the stress. I didn't push. He paused. I lost a lot. My investors lost a lot. The project was supposed to be a legacy thing, a real contribution to that city. I know, I said. I'm sorry. For my part in the cover-up. For the years you spent not knowing the truth. You went to prison for her choices, he said. I made my own choices, I said. I just made them for the wrong reasons. We agreed to meet in person. I flew to Savannah on a Thursday, and we sat on the porch of the house he'd bought after retirement and talked for 6 hours. By the end of it, we'd mapped out something together, a foundation, funded by Eleanor's estate, focused on affordable workforce housing in the Southeast. James would join the board. His name would go on it alongside hers. It was what she'd been good at, the economics of shelter, the business of home, and it was the kind of work that would outlast both of us. I set aside enough from the estate to establish the foundation endowment, $100 million, structured to generate grants and below-market financing for developers willing to build affordable units in communities that needed them. James brought relationships I didn't have. I brought the engineering. Together, we hired a staff and got to work. I kept some of the money. Not extravagantly, I'd spent too many years with very little to be comfortable with excess. I bought a house in Asheville. 3 bedrooms, a yard with old trees, a room for a proper drafting table. I applied to get my engineering license reinstated. The process was long and uncertain, but there were people willing to vouch for me. And eventually the State Board of Engineers reviewed my case and the circumstances of my conviction and granted a conditional restoration. I designed again. Real projects, not just dreams. The foundation commissioned me to design the first development, a 48-unit mixed-income complex in East Nashville, near the neighborhood where Eleanor had first opened her business. We broke ground in the fall. Andrew drove down from Chicago for the groundbreaking. He stood next to me while a woman from the mayor's office said nice things about what the building would mean for the community, and when it was my turn to speak, I kept it short. I said the building was for Eleanor, that it was her way of saying she was sorry, which was the best way she knew through something that would last. Afterward, Andrew and I walked the site. I showed him where the community room would be, the courtyard, the small garden the tenants' association had already requested. She would have been proud of this, he said. I think so, I said. She was always better with things that would last than with things that were happening right now. He smiled at that small, wry, a little sad. His mother's smile. We'd been spending more time together since Nashville. Not dramatically, not with grand gestures of reconciliation. That wasn't how either of us was built. Dinners. Phone calls that lasted longer than 4 minutes. He came to Asheville one weekend, and I showed him the house, the drafting table, the drawings spread across the room. He stood in front of them for a long time. You were always designing something, he said. Even when you were doing nothing else. I needed to have something I was building. He looked at the drawings for a while longer. These are good, he said, like it surprised him. These are really good, Dad. It was the first time in longer than I could easily count that he'd called me that without something else attached to it. He got involved with the foundation shortly after, brought his legal expertise, helped structure the grant program, raised money from his own network with the same intensity he brought to everything. He was Eleanor's son, no question about it, but in his willingness to admit he'd been wrong, in the patience he'd started to show with uncertainty, I could see something else. Something that had maybe always been there, waiting for the story he'd built around himself to stop being the only story available. A year after Eleanor's death, the foundation held its first annual event. Dinner, donors, remarks from the Housing Secretary of Tennessee. Andrew gave a speech. He talked about his mother, her vision, her drive, the way she'd built something from nothing. And then he talked about the part he'd left out of every version of that story for 20 years. About a man who'd gone to prison quietly and come home and started over without complaint. About how the work of the foundation was, in some way, a son's apology to his father, and a father's final gift to a woman who had needed redeeming. I stood at the back of the room and listened. Afterward, we stood outside on the venue's terrace while the event wound down around us. The Nashville night was warm, the way it gets in October, and the lights of the city were spread out below us. She would have hated this kind of event, Andrew said. All these people wanting to be seen giving money. She would have been working the room anyway, I said, shaking every hand. She knew the money was necessary. Yeah, he said. She did. We were quiet for a while. I've been thinking about something, he said. About why you did it. Took the blame. Not the reason you gave me, protecting her, protecting me. The other thing. What other thing? You loved her, he said. Not strategically. Not because you calculated the outcome. You just loved her. And when the moment came, you did what people do when they love someone. You stood in front of it. I thought about that for a moment. That's about right, I said. I don't know if I've ever loved anyone that way, he said. It wasn't self-pity. It was just honest, the kind of honesty he'd been practicing more lately. You will, I said. He looked at me sideways. How do you know? Because you're capable of it, I said. You've been standing in front of things your whole life. You just didn't know whose corner you were in. He didn't answer. But he didn't need to. We stood there a while longer, my son and I, and when the evening finally wound down and the last of the donors filtered out, we walked to our cars together and agreed to have dinner the following week. I am 64 years old now. My engineering license is fully restored. The Nashville development opened in the spring, and I stood at the ribbon cutting and shook hands with tenants who would be moving into homes they could afford, and I thought about all the buildings I'd designed in that spare room in Charlotte that no one ever built, and I thought that this was better. This was the right building. I think about Eleanor. I have made a kind of peace with what she did, and with what I did, and with the fact that neither of us handled the years that followed particularly well. I don't think about the wasted time as often as I used to. I try to think about what she wrote in the letter she left for me, the private one, the one nobody else read. Victor, I know you'd rather give all of it away and live on nothing, and tell yourself that's the noble thing to do, so I'm asking you not to. I'm asking you to build something for yourself. Not for me. Not for Andrew. Not for some legacy for you. You spent 30 years making space for everyone else's life. There's room left. Use it. I kept the letter in my jacket pocket for a few months. I still know exactly where it is. James Whitfield and I had coffee last month. His foundation work has become the thing he's most proud of, which I take as a good sign about both of us. He told me that working on the housing projects had given him something to do with his anger that wasn't just anger anymore. I understood exactly what he meant. Andrew is getting married in the spring. He called to tell me. And when I said I was happy for him, he said, "I want you at the front, Dad. Not in the back. Not slipping out early. Up front." I said I'd be there. Last week, I finished a new design, a community library for a neighborhood in East Atlanta, commissioned by a nonprofit that the foundation helped connect with a donor. It's a real building, not a dream one. It will be built. And when it is, I'll walk through it, and I'll think about Eleanor at 23, taking notes in the front row of a classroom, working 3 jobs, building something out of nothing, because that's what she knew how to do. I'll think about the 2 of us in our first apartment, 28 and 26 years old, absolutely certain we had all the time in the world. I'll think about Andrew calling me Dad from the front of the room, and I'll think that all of it, the loss and the cost, and the long, slow work of coming back, this is still a life. A real one. The kind worth living. I'm living it.